The Whitmore mansion stood on the edge of rural Pennsylvania, its blackened windows staring out at the forest like the empty sockets of a skull. Locals swore the place was cursed. They told stories about people who entered and never came back, about the walls moving like a living creature after midnight, trapping anyone foolish enough to stay. Most dismissed it as small-town ghost lore, but to me, it was the perfect chance to prove everyone wrong. I'd been running a small horror exploration channel on YouTube, and I wanted a real scare, something that would pull in views. So on a cold October evening, I packed my camera, flashlight, and sleeping bag, determined to spend the night inside the mansion. I didn't believe in shifting houses, but by the time the sun rose, I'd learned just how alive a house could be. The driveway was nothing but cracked gravel and weeds. My car's headlight swept over the massive silhouette of the Whitmore mansion, revealing peeling paint and warped wood. A cold wind howled through broken shutters, making the place seem almost awake. I parked and stepped out into the biting air. The front doors loomed at least 10 feet high, their faded red paint flaking under my touch. With a groan, one of them swung open on its own. I told myself it was the wind, but a shiver ran up my spine as I stepped inside. The entry hall was enormous, wide staircase curving upward into darkness, a chandelier hanging from a chain so rusted it looked ready to snap. My boots clicked on the marble floor, each step echoing far longer than it should have. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. I explored for hours. The dining hall still had a long table, set with dishes coated in grime. The study was lined with books whose pages crumbled at the touch. Upstairs, bedrooms lay in decay, broken beds, torn curtains, and dressers left open as if someone had left in a hurry. At 11:30 p.m., I returned to the first floor and spread my sleeping bag in the drawing room. I figured I'd get some rest before midnight, before the time the so-called shifting was supposed to happen. Outside, the forest swayed in the wind. Inside, it was utterly still. I woke to a sound. Not the creak of settling wood, but something heavier like furniture scraping across a floor. I sat up, heart pounding, and checked my phone. 12:01 a.m. My flashlight beam cut across the room, and I froze. The doorway I had walked through earlier wasn't there anymore. In its place was a wall. I stood, panic clawing at my chest, and ran to the opposite side of the room, expecting the hall to be there. Instead, I found a narrow corridor I didn't remember. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. I followed the corridor, hoping it led to the entry hall, but it twisted sharply, then again, leading me deeper into the house. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing strange symbols carved into the wood beneath. At some point, I realized I was walking in circles. I passed the same toppled chair twice, but the walls around it kept changing, sometimes wood-paneled, sometimes brick, sometimes plaster. My flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I heard a whisper right next to my ear. "Stay." I spun around, but no one was there. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed as I searched for an exit. Every time I turned a corner, the layout was different. I came to a hallway lined with mirrors, each one warped and cloudy. My reflection lagged behind my movements by a second, then smiled when I didn't. I smashed one of the mirrors with my flashlight. Behind it was not a wall, but another room, lit by a single candle. I climbed through the jagged glass frame, cutting my hand in the process. Inside the candlelit room was a small wooden table, and on it, 3 framed photographs. Each showed a different person, a young woman, an older man, and a boy around 12. All of them looked terrified, eyes wide as if staring at something behind the photographer. My stomach dropped when I noticed the background in all 3 photos. It was the exact room I was standing in. The candle blew out. Darkness swallowed me whole. I turned on my flashlight, but its beam barely reached a few feet ahead. From somewhere deep in the house, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. I ran. Hallways twisted under my feet, doors opened into brick walls, and stairs led to ceilings. The house was moving faster now, almost as if it was guiding me somewhere. My lungs burned, my legs shook, but I couldn't stop. Then I entered a room I hadn't seen before. It was massive, circular, with walls lined in faded red velvet. In the center stood a grand four-poster bed. Lying on it, pale as wax, was the boy from the photograph. His eyes darted toward me, and he opened his mouth to speak, but before a sound came out, the walls behind me slammed shut. The floor trembled, and the bed began to sink into it, dragging the boy down. I lunged forward to grab him, but an invisible force shoved me back so hard I hit the wall. When I looked again, the bed and the boy were gone. The room began to change around me. The red velvet walls faded into rotting wood, the floorboards curling upward like claws. I could feel the house breathing, slow, steady, each exhale rattling through the walls. In the corner, a door appeared where there hadn't been one before. I didn't hesitate. I threw it open and found myself in the entry hall again, the front doors just ahead. Relief surged through me, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. Behind me, footsteps echoed. I turned and saw shapes emerging from the shadows, figures with empty eyes and slack jaws, their skin grey and cracked like old plaster. They moved slowly, but I could feel the air thickening, pressing me toward them. I slammed my shoulder into the door. Twice. On the third try, it burst open, and I stumbled out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I looked back once, just in time to see the front doors of the Whitmore mansion swing shut on their own. The footage from my camera was mostly static, though a few frames showed warped hallways and shadowy figures. I posted the video online, but most viewers thought it was staged. Only one comment stood out, a username I didn't recognize. It read, "You left the door open. We can find you now." I moved out of Pennsylvania a week later. But some nights, when I wake in the dark, I swear my bedroom door is in a different place than it was the night before. It was a quiet evening in late October when the Callahan family checked into the old hotel nestled in a small, forgotten town in the heart of the United States. John and Rebecca, both in their late 30s, had decided to take their two children, Emily, aged 10, and Charlie, aged 6, on a weekend getaway to celebrate the end of the school year. The air was crisp, the trees a fiery mix of red, orange, and yellow, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Their destination, the Hollow Springs Inn. An establishment that had been in operation since the 1800s, with a history as long as the town itself. It was charming in its own way, with its weathered brick exterior, vintage wallpaper in the hallways, and squeaky wooden floors that seemed to echo the whispers of a past long gone. The hotel had recently been refurbished, though, with modern amenities, Wi-Fi, flat-screen TVs, and heated pools. Everything seemed fine at first glance. But there was something about the place that didn't feel entirely right. The check-in process was quick. The receptionist, a pale woman in her 50s with sharp features, greeted them with a thin smile. "Room 111, she said, handing over the keys. "It's a bit special, but you'll enjoy your stay." Rebecca, slightly confused, smiled back. "Special? In what way?" The receptionist paused, her eyes darting briefly toward the ceiling before she quickly cleared her throat. "Oh, nothing to worry about. Just an old room. All the charm, you know? Just make sure not to wander after dark. The hallways can get a little strange." John chuckled, trying to brush off the odd remark. "Thanks for the warning," he said, taking the keys and leading his family toward the elevator. Room 111 was located on the third floor, at the far end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a spacious room with antique furniture, an oversized four-poster bed, a velvet armchair near the window, and an old oak wardrobe in the corner. There was a musty smell in the air, but it wasn't enough to turn them away. Emily immediately rushed to the window, pressing her face against the glass and peering out into the darkening evening. "This place is so cool," she said, excited by the large, vintage feel of the room. Charlie ran toward the bed, jumping up and down. "I want to sleep here tonight." Rebecca smiled at her children's enthusiasm. "Well, it's going to be our home for the next couple of days, so let's make the most of it." John, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He noticed the edges of the curtains fluttering in an almost unnatural way, even though the window was firmly closed. It felt like there was a draft, yet there was no source for it. He shrugged it off, figuring it was just the building's age catching up with it. After unpacking, the Callahans decided to take a walk around the town. They enjoyed a casual dinner at a local diner, with the owner, an elderly man with a deep southern drawl, telling them stories about the history of Hollow Springs. He mentioned the hotel briefly but spoke of it in hushed tones, as if not wanting to draw attention to its past. "You folks be careful with that hotel," he said, leaning in closer. "A lot of strange things happen there. You might think it's all harmless at first, but you'd be wrong. Stay away from room 111 if you know what's good for YA." John laughed, thinking the man was just playing a part to entertain the tourists. "Thanks for the tip," he said, dismissing it as an old man's superstition. By the time they returned to the hotel, the sun had set, and the building had taken on an even more eerie presence. The hallway was now completely dark, with only dim lights flickering overhead. As they reached room 111, Rebecca unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. The warm air they had left behind now felt cold, almost icy. Emily and Charlie were already climbing into bed, their faces glowing with excitement from the day's adventures. But John and Rebecca both felt a lingering sense of unease. The room seemed to hum with a strange energy. John went to the bathroom to wash up, and when he returned, he noticed the shadows in the room seemed deeper, darker, as if they were moving on their own. The corner of the room, near the wardrobe, felt especially cold. He could almost feel someone, or something, watching him. He shook his head, trying to rationalize the feeling. It was just the stress of travel, he told himself. Rebecca, however, was having her own unsettling experience. She had heard faint footsteps in the hallway, light and quick, as if someone were running. But when she opened the door to check, no one was there. "John," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think we should go down to the lobby and ask for a different room." Before John could respond, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. Charlie, who had been playing with his toy car, suddenly stopped and looked toward the wardrobe. His eyes widened in terror. "Mommy, Daddy, there's someone in the closet." Rebecca and John turned, but the wardrobe door was closed. There was no sound, no movement. It was as if the room had frozen. That night, the haunting escalated. The family barely slept. Emily had nightmares of shadowy figures standing by her bed, whispering things she couldn't understand. Charlie was up several times, screaming that he saw someone standing in the hallway. But when John opened the door, nothing was there. By morning, the Callahans were exhausted and on edge. John, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it all. "Old buildings do strange things," he muttered. "There's got to be a logical explanation for everything." But that afternoon, when Rebecca returned from the lobby after a visit to the front desk, she looked pale, her face etched with fear. She pulled John aside. "They know about room 111, she whispered, her voice shaking. "They told me it's been the site of strange occurrences for decades. People have disappeared. Some have claimed to see figures in the mirrors, others have heard voices, like someone's calling their name. And the last family who stayed here, well, they didn't make it out." John's heart raced. He was beginning to believe there was something more to the hotel than just age and wear. The stories he had dismissed as superstition were starting to feel all too real. On their last night, the atmosphere in room 111 became suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air was thick with tension. Emily was crying, clutching her stuffed bear tightly, while Charlie refused to leave his parents' side. The mirrors began to fog up, even though the room was far too cold for condensation to form. As they huddled together in the center of the room, the door to the wardrobe slowly creaked open on its own. The temperature dropped so sharply that their breaths fogged in the air. And then, it began. Soft whispers, like distant voices, echoed through the room, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. The shadows in the corner began to twist, taking on shapes that no one could explain. John grabbed Rebecca's hand, pulling her and the children toward the door. "Run," he whispered, his voice a mix of fear and determination. But as they reached the hallway, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, trapping them in the dark corridor. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakably coming from behind them. They turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the dark, its form barely discernible but its presence unmistakable. It was time to leave. The Callahans never returned to Hollow Springs Inn. They checked out the next morning, their spirits broken, their nerves frazzled, and their minds haunted by the horrors they'd experienced in room 111. They left town, but the memory of that night stayed with them forever. No one else dared to stay in room 111 after the Callahans left. The hotel eventually closed its doors, and Hollow Springs faded into obscurity. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the faint whispers of those who were lost in that cursed room, waiting for someone else to wander in and disturb the silence once more. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? A shadow in the corner of your eye, a cold draft in a room that should be warm, or a voice when no one else is around? Share your own paranormal experiences with us. Who knows, your story might be the next to haunt room 111. The library at Hollow Creek High School was the oldest part of the entire campus. Everything else had been modernized: bright white hallways, polished linoleum floors, security cameras on every corner, and a glass-walled cafeteria filled with sunlight. But the library was different. It had survived every renovation, every storm, and every budget cut. Its dark oak shelves, warped wooden floorboards, and the faint, ever-present scent of dust and paper made it feel like a time capsule from another world. Students often said that the library wasn't really part of Hollow Creek High at all. According to old records, it had been inherited from Hollow Creek Academy, a private boarding school that stood there long before the high school was built. The academy had closed after a fire in 1953 that took the lives of 19 students. When the new high school opened in the 70s, the surviving west wing of the old academy had been rebuilt into the library. Teachers avoided talking about it, but everyone in town knew the story. Still, the strangest rumor of all was about the last shelf, the one tucked away in the farthest corner of the back wall, half hidden by shadows and a sagging curtain. There was a small metal chain stretched across it and a faded paper sign that read, in crooked handwriting, "Restricted. Do not open." Nobody ever questioned it too seriously. The students assumed it was just old or damaged books. Mrs. Harrow, the librarian, never allowed anyone near it. She wasn't cruel, just firm. If someone asked, she would simply smile tightly and say, "That section isn't for students." And that was the end of the conversation. For decades, the rule went unquestioned. Until 3 students decided to break it. Ethan Carter, Liam Brooks, and Chloe Rivera were juniors, friends since middle school, though friends might have been generous. Ethan was the instigator of almost every bit of trouble they got into. Smart but restless, he hated rules that didn't have reasons. Liam was quieter, the voice of reason who often got dragged along because he didn't like saying no. Chloe, the yearbook photographer, liked stories that sounded like they belonged in a movie. She had a habit of treating every mystery like an adventure waiting to be documented. It was a rainy Friday in October when the idea came up. The storm had been relentless all day, and lunch period was cancelled due to lightning. Students were told to stay indoors. The 3 of them ended up in the library, sitting at a corner table where the light flickered slightly with each rumble of thunder. Chloe had been flipping through an old school yearbook, one from the early 50s that Mrs. Harrow kept in a display case. She pointed at a faded black and white photo of a girl smiling in a checkered dress. The caption read, "Margaret Hale, class of 1953. Chloe whispered that her older sister had told her a story about the fire, how Margaret Hale was the only student marked present in the attendance records after the tragedy. All the others were listed as missing or deceased. Ethan grinned, intrigued. A mystery. A name. A forbidden part of the library. He said they should see if that shelf really held old records. Liam tried to laugh it off, but he couldn't hide the nervous glance he cast toward the dark back corner. The rain hammered harder against the windows. The lights flickered again, and Mrs. Harrow, sitting at her desk near the entrance, didn't even seem to notice. She just typed away quietly, the rhythmic click of her keys the only steady sound in the room. By the end of the school day, the plan was set. The three would come back after hours. No teachers, no librarians, just them and the mystery of the last shelf. When the final bell rang, they pretended to leave with everyone else, then doubled back. Ethan knew the side door's latch never closed properly. They slipped in around 6, long after the custodians had left. The storm was still raging outside, wind howling through the eaves, the sky flashing white every few seconds. The library was darker than they expected. Only a few emergency lights cast dim orange pools across the floor. Their footsteps echoed as they crept between the rows of shelves. Dust drifted in the air, glowing faintly in the light of their phone flashlights. Liam hesitated. He whispered that maybe they should wait until Monday, maybe ask Mrs. Harrow directly. Ethan ignored him and kept walking. The air grew colder as they moved toward the back. The floor creaked beneath their sneakers. At last, they stood before the final shelf. It leaned slightly to one side, its wooden edges rough and splintered with age. The chain hung loosely across the middle, the restricted sign half torn. Ethan ran his hand over it. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, like touching metal in winter. He unhooked the chain and dropped it to the floor. Behind the first row of dusty books, he noticed something unusual. The books didn't have titles, just numbers etched into their spines. He pulled one out. The cover read, in fading gold letters, Hollow Creek Academy, Attendance 1953. He opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with neat handwriting. A list of names, each marked with a check mark next to the word present. Every line had been crossed out in thick black ink, except the last one. Margaret Hale, present. Chloe leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. She said that was the same name from the yearbook photo. Liam muttered that it was probably just coincidence. Then, before they could say another word, the lights went out. Everything was silent for a moment except the rain outside. Then came a faint sound, like pages turning in the dark. Ethan lifted his phone to look around. The beam shook in his hand. Chloe's flashlight caught the edge of the shelf, and for a split second, they saw something move behind it. A whisper floated through the air, barely audible. It was soft, like breath against their ears. Liam froze. Chloe's eyes went wide. The whisper came again, closer this time. The books began to tremble, one by one. Dust fell like ash from the shelves. A single book slid out and dropped to the floor. Then another. Then all at once, they began to fly outward, scattering across the room. Ethan picked up the attendance book again, his hands trembling. A new line of ink was appearing beneath Margaret Hale's name. His breath caught. He dropped the book. Liam grabbed his arm, shouting that they had to go. But the whisper was growing louder now, overlapping, multiplying, voices of dozens of students all murmuring the same word. Present. 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 They ran for the exit. The door was only a few feet away, but when Ethan grabbed the handle, it wouldn't move. It felt locked, though he'd left it open. The metal was ice cold, burning his skin. He yanked harder. Nothing. The library fell silent again. Then came a deep, creaking sound from behind them. The last shelf had shifted forward, scraping against the floor. Behind it, a thin sliver of light glowed through a crack in the wall. Ethan turned slowly. He could see what looked like a narrow passage hidden behind the shelf. He stepped toward it before the others could stop him and pushed the shelf aside. A rush of cold air swept out, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something older, something burnt and forgotten. Beyond the crack was a small room, its walls blackened by soot. A single desk sat in the center, covered in ashes and half-melted candles. On the far wall, written in faded red paint, were the words, "All students must be accounted for." The air was so cold that their breath came out in visible clouds. Ethan's flashlight flickered. On the desk lay another attendance sheet, charred around the edges. He picked it up carefully. Every name was marked present, but the last few had been crossed out violently, gouged through with what looked like fingernails instead of ink. Liam whispered that they needed to leave, but before they could move, a soft sob broke the silence. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged, a girl in a burn school uniform. Her skin was pale and cracked, her hair hanging in clumps over her face. Smoke curled faintly around her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You're late for roll call," Chloe screamed. Ethan stumbled back. The door they'd come through slammed shut. The girl tilted her head. "You weren't here before," she said. "Now you are." The attendance book on the desk snapped open by itself. The pages flipped rapidly until the pen marks began to move again, forming new names. Liam Brooks, present. Chloe Rivera, present. Ethan shouted for it to stop, but the girl just stared at him. "You came when you weren't called," she whispered. Her voice echoed as if more than one person were speaking at once. Ethan grabbed a candle from the desk and threw it. The wax splattered across the wall, but the flame reignited midair and crawled upward. The girl's cracked lips curved into a faint smile. "Fire doesn't hurt me anymore." Flames erupted along the walls. Smoke filled the tiny room. Chloe coughed, stumbling toward the far end where she spotted a small, boarded-up window. Ethan smashed it open with a chair. Rain poured in, the wind howling through the gap. Chloe climbed first, cutting her hands on the glass. Liam followed, dragging himself through. Ethan was last, but as he pulled himself up, something gripped his ankle. The girl's cold fingers wrapped around him. Her empty eyes stared up. "You can't leave," she whispered. "You're on the list now." Ethan kicked wildly, screaming. Liam reached through the window, grabbed his arm, and pulled with all his strength. With one final wrench, Ethan broke free. The three of them fell out into the mud and the rain. When they looked back through the shattered window, the fire was gone. The room was dark. The shelf looked untouched. They ran until the school was a blur behind them. None of them spoke on the way home. The next morning, the principal didn't believe a word of their story. The library was fine, no burn marks, no broken window, no fallen books. When they tried to show the attendance records, the shelf was full of ordinary textbooks. Mrs. Harrow was calm but pale when she called them into her office. Her voice shook as she said, "You opened it, didn't you?" Ethan nodded slowly. She told them the truth. Margaret Hale had been a student the night the academy burned down. She wasn't in her seat during evening roll call, and she was the only one who survived. When they found the attendance book in the ashes, every name had been marked present except hers. For years, the staff believed her spirit lingered, still trying to finish attendance. That was why the shelf was sealed, the books hidden, so no one would disturb her routine. Chloe whispered, "So she stayed?" Mrs. Harrow's eyes filled with tears. She stayed to finish roll call. After that day, things changed. Chloe stopped coming to the library altogether. Liam transferred schools at semester break. Ethan tried to act like nothing had happened, but he started having dreams, always the same one. He'd hear the whisper behind him, soft and slow. "Present." He'd wake up drenched in sweat, his phone alarm showing 3:33 a.m. every time. 3 weeks later, Chloe didn't show up to class. Her locker was open. Her backpack sat untouched. No one saw her leave. When Ethan went to the library that afternoon, the restricted sign was gone. In its place was a new one, "Do not disturb during roll call." On the librarian's desk sat the old attendance book, perfectly clean. Only one fresh name was written on the page. Chloe Rivera, present. Beneath it, a blank line waited, the pen resting beside it. Ethan Carter, he didn't stay long enough to see it finish. Now, years later, Hollow Creek High has been renovated again. The library is bright and modern, with glass walls and touchscreen computers. Students love the new look, but in the far corner, there's still one untouched section, a single old shelf with no catalog number. Sometimes, during morning roll call, a student might swear they hear something from that direction. A faint scratching sound, like a pen moving across paper. And if they linger a moment too long, they'll feel a chill brush against their ear and a soft, calm voice whisper one word.